Our discussion today with Bryan Soukup from ASID. Bryan, again, so grateful that you're joining us here today to discuss advocacy for diversity and inclusion in the design industry. So excited that you'll speak about a practice rights bill, and we will learn how to become citizen and practice advocates in the profession. Thank you to Janet Roach of our BIC Alumni Advisory Council, a champion of social justice. And Janet, thank you for arranging this wonderful lunchtime discussion, our first actually lunchtime discussion with ASID. And I want to thank our student leaders from our BIC Student NOMAS chapter who have provided the questions that will guide Bryan through his presentation today. So Bryan, thank you so much. It's a big day for social justice here at the BIC, and we're so excited that you're part of this with us. So I will turn it over to you and allow you to share your remarks. And then just as a order of operations for our audience, when we go through the presentation, we will not be live on camera, but we will be available. Bryan will be talking us through. Please ask questions. Hi, Denise. Please ask questions in the chat as we go along. And again, thank you. So thank you for spending your lunch with us, and enjoy your water, coffee, tea, or lemonade. And Bryan, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Eliza. And are you getting feedback? I think there we go.
Yeah, in the chat, lots of hellos and.
Great. Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Eliza, and thank you so much to the BAC for allowing me to speak to you all this afternoon. The BAC is a fantastic institution. I had a great opportunity along with Janet Roach to tour the BAC back almost a year ago. I think it was last October, and to meet with some faculty and students there. And it's great to be back with you on this historic day as you talk quite a bit about social justice and what we can do to make our world and our school and our country a better place. So I'm honored to be in this position to be able to talk to you today. In just a few minutes, we'll start a PowerPoint presentation that I'll walk us through. As Eliza mentioned, I'll go off camera, but we'll be able to walk through that presentation together. And then, of course, at the end, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any of them I can. If I can, I'm happy to try to get you those answers. And if we're not able to get to everybody, please feel free to email me. My information will be on the presentation. So with that, Eliza, why don't we get off the screen here and bring up the PowerPoint if you don't mind. So Eliza, if you can go back a few slides just for the roadmap, the other direction if you don't mind. Yep, there we go. A couple more.
Slide one.
Perfect. There we go. So again, I'm Bryan Soukup. I'm the Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for the American Society of Interior Designers. So I work with ASID and our almost 24,000 members on both regulatory and statutory law, both at the federal level, so with the US Congress, and around the states and of course the local level as well. And what we do at ASID and what the Government and Public Affairs Department does at ASID is to make sure that in public policy and in law that interior designers are represented, and that the interests of interior designers are represented, and that the profession itself and the industry is advocated for, that it is advanced, and that it is protected when it needs some protection. So those are some of the issues we'll talk about today, but of course, the centerpiece of today's presentation will be about diversity and inclusion, and the public policies and advocacy around diversity and inclusion in the design industry. And I've broken it down into 5 different areas of ways public policy and the standards of the industry can affect diversity and inclusion. And we'll start with racial diversity. We'll talk about socioeconomic diversity. We'll talk about gender diversity, diversity of ability, and neurodiversity. And as Eliza pointed out, we'll also talk about what it is to be an advocate, what is advocacy and why you should become an advocate. And we'll also talk about how you can get involved and be effective. Next slide, please. So we'll start with diversity and inclusion issues in public policy. Next slide, please. So at ASID, if any of you are student members of ASID or professional members of ASID, you know that the motto for ASID is design impacts lives. And I think that's such an important thing to remember as you go through your journey at school to become an interior designer or an architect, that everything you do will impact the life of somebody that you're designing for, whether they live there, whether they work there, whatever the use of that building or that structure or that space is, you will impact a life. Design can be a great equalizer. Now we're talking about diversity and inclusion. Design can be a great equalizer. So you think of something like wayfinding. You think about how a person who doesn't speak English automatically knows where an exit might be or where a bathroom might be. That's not necessarily because they understand the signs, because a good designer understands where to place certain things that make the most sense for everybody universally, regardless of their ethnicity or what language they speak. Design can also empower people. And a little later, we'll talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, but making sure that somebody in a wheelchair can feel empowered to use a space, can feel empowered to be a leader in that space because of the way that space is designed. And it also can instill dignity. A great example I always like to share is one of the ASID members I know really well works in homeless shelters, and how the lighting in homeless shelters is so important, because if you're a homeless person who's getting ready for their first ever job interview or their first job interview in a long time, the way you look in that mirror that morning with the lighting and how everything's situated in the room can really give you the extra confidence to nail that job interview. So design is so important, and it's so important for inclusivity in our world. Next slide, please. So how can interior design and the design profession improve diversity and inclusion in the United States? Well, as I just said, design touches everyone. Whether you work in a structure or a space, you live in a structure or a space, you unfortunately live in a homeless shelter, or you attend a school, whatever it might be, everybody uses interior spaces. There's the four walls, and then there's the roof. So there are very few people in this world, especially in the United States, that aren't touched by spaces that interior designers and architects design. So it's really important to bring more interior designers into the planning and construction process. Architects are generally used in the construction process, engineers, general contractors, but interior designers aren't always utilized in the design space and in the construction space. People have the mistaken belief that interior design is only about decoration or about aesthetics, and that couldn't be further from the truth, and all of you who are studying it know that to be the case. But we need to bring more interior designers into every project, whether it's a government project or a private project, a big project or a small project. We need to bring interior designers into space because they know how to design for inclusion. We also need to diversify the profession, and in a few minutes we'll be talking about diversity. And I have a fantastic quote that I just saw recently that I really appreciate and love, and it's, diversity isn't just about race, but also variety and culture and experience. It's like a tapestry of many different things. And if that quote sounds familiar to you, or if that quote resonates with you, it's because it's from the Dean of Interior Architecture at the BAC. It's from Denise Rush, one of my favorite members, and somebody who's such a wonderful person and a wonderful contributor to the profession and to ASID, Denise is. And it's so true what that quote means. It's not just about racial diversity, but it's about diversity of experience. It's about diversity of culture. It's about all sorts of diversity, and those things all combine together. When we share those things, when we open our networks, and when we work with people that we don't normally work with or socialize with, it really can improve design. So great work, Denise, and such a great quote. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about racial diversity. Next slide. So these are some statistics. They're from NCARB, they're from ASID, they're from the industry, but it really speaks to some of the issues that we do need to address. It is no secret that the design industry has some work to do when it comes to diversity in the profession. Only 6.8% of the design industry is Black. Only 2% of registered architects in the United States are Black, and only 0.3% of registered architects in the United States are Black women. So clearly, we have some work to do when it comes to the demographics of this profession and bringing in those diverse experiences and backgrounds that we were just talking about. Next slide, please. So ASID recently, through our August 2020 chair's message, made a few commitments and made a few statements about this issue. And ASID is committing the profession and design thinking to Black communities, Black practitioners, and critical related issues. We are going to help build a much needed pipeline of Black designers that begins with finding meaningful ways to engage traditionally with overlooked communities. And of course, with everything that's going on in the world, an important focus must be bringing the Black perspective into interior design more frequently than it is right now. But we also need to look at inclusion for all. Most racial and ethnic minorities are underserved in the interior design industry. So we need to make sure we're looking at Hispanic designers, we're looking at Asian designers, we're looking at Native American designers. We're looking at designers of all different sorts of backgrounds and experiences to bring them into the practice and the profession so that we can make the best spaces that are most accessible and inclusive for all. Next slide, please. So this is, of course, part of racial diversity, but this is another issue that we need to talk about when we talk about diversifying the design experience, diversifying the design practice, and also diversifying our spaces, and that's socioeconomic diversity. So there are some potentials to diversifying the industry, and we'll talk about a few of them today. And one of them is, of course, socioeconomic. And a great graphic that I always love to share when I talk about diversity, especially with interior designers, because I know interior designers and architects are very visual people, is this graphic picture on the screen, which is equality versus equity. Equality is making sure that everybody has the same opportunity to engage in something. So, right, there is no law that says an Asian person can't become an interior designer, right? So technically, everybody has the same opportunity to enter interior design or to do other things in this country and in this world. Equity is about making sure that we are approaching these opportunities at the same level. So if a person doesn't grow up with the financial resources to go to college, for example, they're not starting out in the same position that a person with the financial resources to attend college starts with. So we need to make sure that we're providing, especially in our industry, the design industry, the same opportunities and the same abilities and access to both education and design. We have to ask ourselves, who has access to the education? You have to ask yourself, once an education is secured, what are the hoops one needs to jump through to get regulated? And then once in the profession, is there equitable career advancement? Those are all really important things to make sure that we have socioeconomic diversity and equality in interior design. Next slide, please. So again, a hurdle could be the cost. Most colleges and universities in this country are more than $50,000 a year to attend that college or university. To study and take the NCIDQ exam, it could cost more than $2,000 each time you have to take it for the study materials, for the registration, and so forth. And then depending on what state you live in, and hopefully in your state you do have some sort of registration law that either protects your title as a educated and professional interior designer or gives you practice rights. And depending on the state, it could be up to $50 to $300 a year or biennially to register or become certified in that state. New York, for example, the number is close to $300. That prices a lot of people out of being able to register or become certified or licensed as an interior designer in that state. So there are a lot of factors to think about when we consider what we can do to diversify the interior design experience and diversify the profession, because not everyone can afford to become an interior designer. Next slide, please. So looking at solutions, again, this is going to be a major public policy discussion because that is what I do at ASID. And I think that our laws and our regulations, and this has been proven time again, between the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s to the Americans with Disabilities Act in the 1990s, some of the things we'll talk about today, that laws and regulations can really change the world. Laws and regulations clearly can change our profession for the good or the bad. So let's talk about some ways that, and some ideas that are out there right now as to how we can change some of these negative aspects of our world. And a great example and a great solution is supporting policies to bring lower income individuals into interior design. And about a year ago, there was a bill that was introduced in the US Congress. I'm a registered federal lobbyist, so I do represent ASID and interior designers in the Capitol on federal issues. And this was introduced by Representative Bobby Rush. Bobby Rush is a Democrat from Illinois. He's an African-American lawmaker. And the title of that legislation was the Blue Collar to Green Collar Jobs Development Act. And what this act would do, it would reauthorize and expand the Department of Energy's Office of Minority Economic Impact to improve the education and training of underrepresented groups for employment and sustainability-related industries. It would also direct assistance to educational institutions, perhaps a BAC, nonprofit organizations, perhaps ASID or IIDA, and workforce development boards. It would establish a grant program to help eligible businesses pay for employees to receive renewable energy and energy efficiency training. And it would establish a clearinghouse of information and resources for those seeking sustainability-related jobs. Now, hopefully, many of you know, as you're going through your training to become an interior designer or an architect, how interior design and architecture can really impact sustainability, how interior design can impact energy efficiency, from the window coverings to the type of window used to the way you space plan to make a space larger or smaller. That affects energy efficiency as well, of course. So I absolutely believe that interior design and schools that have interior design and architecture programs and associations like ASID that train and educate and work with interior designers would be eligible for this. So again, this is a great way to provide grants and educational opportunities for people who might have been priced out of interior design schools or priced out of taking the NCIDQ to further their education, because again, interior design does affect energy efficiency and interior design does affect sustainability. Next slide, please. So another solution could be supporting policies to bring good design to underserved populations. And this is something that I've been passionate about throughout my career. I worked for the International Code Council before coming to ASID. And one of the things that we would hear is that building codes are pricing people out of homes. Building codes, up-to-date, modern, safe building codes are pricing people out of buildings and so forth. And my response to that was, so does that mean that people who can only afford low-income housing should not have safety or should not have modern homes and buildings to use? And I think the answer to that is absolutely not. Even government housing, even public assistance housing should be designed to the best standards possible. Government assisted housing should have an interior designer on the project. So we look at a bill that again was introduced last year from Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Representative Ocasio-Cortez in New York, called the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act. And this bill would, some of the ideas behind this bill are that people should have adequate and affordable housing choices in livable communities, that housing should be sited and designed to optimize natural light, fresh air, energy efficiency, and foster a sense of belonging. And that, one of the reasons why this was introduced is that in the past, public housing units have not always included these components that are essential to ensuring the public's health, safety, and welfare. And if you look at that second bullet point, optimizing natural light, fresh air, energy efficiency, a sense of belonging, these are all things that through the human-centered approach of interior design, that interior designers really make sure that these are included in housing and buildings for everyone, regardless of your socioeconomic status. So this is something that ASID supports, and this is something that ASID works on at the federal level to make sure that design is helping that good design is helping everyone, regardless of socioeconomic status. Next slide, please. So we'll talk briefly now about design and gender diversity. And this is a really great opportunity for interior design to help bring some gender diversity to some other components of construction and design. So let's talk about the challenge. It is very clear that construction is a male-dominated construction industry. It's a male-dominated industry. More than 91% of the construction industry is male. Approximately 9% is female, but aside from interior designers and architects and some engineers, these are folks working behind a desk, doing some management or administrative roles. Not that those roles are not important, but these are not the core practices of construction. On building sites, it's estimated that 99% of workers are men. I have a condominium going up around the corner from me, and I walk by it a lot when I go to the grocery store and whatnot, and I don't see many women there. And I'm sure as you walk by construction sites too, you'll see that statistic, though shocking, is probably very accurate. 50% of construction companies state that they have never hired a woman manager at their business. Only 24% of the overall engineering workforce in the United States are women, and women make up only 36% of licensed architects. Next slide, please. So we have an opportunity here. And when we talk about advocacy later, we'll talk about how advocacy is not just about pointing out problems and complaining. It's about finding solutions, finding opportunities. So we do have an opportunity, and that opportunity is the demographic of the interior design profession. And as you probably are well aware, more than 80% of interior design practitioners are women. So we have an untapped resource of female practitioners who can work in construction, get on those job sites, and really diversify the construction profession. So how can we include female practitioners in construction? Well, we need to empower interior designers. And as I said earlier, it's not just about communications. It's not just about continuing education. It's about law and legislation. And that's really what I do. And I work with IIDA, my coworkers over at IIDA. That's what we do for the profession. We empower interior designers through legislation and regulation. So you can see on the screen, unfortunately, gray are the states where there are no interior designer laws or regulations. So anybody can be an interior designer. And I don't mean that in a positive sense that you can grow up to be an interior designer. I mean anybody, regardless of education, experience, examination, skill, and so forth, can hold themselves out to be an interior designer. And the different colors, if you go to ASID's website, you can learn more about the different colors. I won't go into it now, just because it would take too much time, and I want to have time for questions. But you can see there are varying degrees of regulation and registration in the United States for interior designers, along with practice rights. The first of those sorts of practice rights is title acts. And in those states, interior designers are allowed to call themselves either registered, licensed, or certified. It differentiates the educated, experienced, and tested interior designer, NCIDQ certified interior designer, from perhaps your weekend hobbyist who's just doing decoration. So that's a start, but unfortunately, it doesn't provide any sort of practice or business rights along with that title. So that's a good start, but we want to push further. And what we want to push is practice rights. And the first and foremost thing we want to push is the ability to permit. And we'll talk about in just a few slides what this means. We also want to push firm ownership legislation. Did you know that in most states around the country, an interior designer cannot own the majority of a architectural interior design firm or a multidisciplinary architectural interior design engineering firm? That means that if you have a architectural interior design firm and the interior designer is bringing in 95% of the business and the architect is only bringing in 5% of the business, if that architect were to leave, if that architect were to pass away, the interior designer could not own that business. Now, the reasoning, stated reasoning behind that, and why that's law in most states, is that if you are a professional or a client rather looking for architectural interior design work, you want to make sure that the person doing that architectural work is trained to do the architectural work, the structural work. That is obviously heavily impacting of health, safety, and welfare. But it leaves out the fact that these interior designers are also highly educated, are also impacting the health, safety, welfare, and are also more than competent to take insurance responsibility for the architects and the architectural work in that firm. But it's something that I think is very unfair and something that really is preventing women entrepreneurs, interior designers who are women, from actually growing in their firms, starting their own firms, and owning multidisciplinary firms. And again, this is in most states across the country, unfortunately. And procurement legislation. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Next slide, please. So in Massachusetts, we have a bit of a combination of rights in Massachusetts. We're certainly not where we want to be, but we're hoping to get there in the next couple of years, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's first talk about procurement rights. And what I mean by procurement rights is in most states, interior designers do not have the ability to be the prime contractor on state and federal government work. That means that if you're an interior designer and there is a federal courthouse that needs to be renovated and it requires interior design work, architectural work, engineering work, and so forth, that the interior designer can't be the person to say, me and my business, me and my firm, we're going to either on our staff, we have architects and engineers, or we're going to subcontract architects or engineers, but we're going to be the prime bidder, we're going to be the business owner in charge, and it's going to be the interior designer who is going to be leading the project. In most states, that is not possible. I'm happy to say within the last few years, Massachusetts was the first state to allow that. So Massachusetts interior designers and interior design firms are allowed to be the prime contractor on government work. That's a huge step in the right direction. Unfortunately, Massachusetts doesn't have a Title Act, so there is no legal right to differentiate yourself between those of us who are experienced, educated, examined, and NCIDQ certified versus people who are perhaps just hobbyists interested in decoration. There is definitely no practice or permitting act And again, that's such an important part of this. The permitting is so important. If you're an interior designer, now many interior designers work in architecture firms, many interior designers work in multidisciplinary commercial firms, where you are working alongside with an architect, and then the architect takes your work, reviews it and stamps it and puts it in with his or her work. But if you're a small business interior designer, if you're a solo practitioner, and 84% of firms in the United States are small firms of 4 or fewer interior designer. If you're a small business interior designer, you need the ability to stamp your own plans. You don't have the ability to hire an architect to do that for you. Or the finances. You don't have the finances to hire an architect to do that for you. So for interior design work, you need the ability to stamp your own plans. Otherwise, you're going to have to go out to an architect or an engineer and pay that architect or engineer to review and sign your work. So we think that is core, both ASID and IIDA, that is core to the independent practice of interior designers. The ability is to have your own stamp and seal and to permit your own work. And we actually, in just a minute, we'll talk about that. We have a bill right now running in Massachusetts to bring that. We also have a bill right now in Massachusetts to bring firm ownership. Unfortunately, right now in Massachusetts, interior designers cannot be the majority owner of a multidisciplinary construction firm, interior design, architecture, engineering, and we're working on that as well. Next slide, please. So again, in Massachusetts, we have Senate Bill 165. It is taking the title, will put in a title restriction, it will put in a Practice and Permitting Act, and it will put in a firm ownership component as well. And I want to be very clear. At ASID and IIDA, we decided a long time ago that we do not pursue mandatory acts like this. So if you're somebody who's working in a firm and you're working for an architect and you have no desire to take on the liability of having your own stamp and you want to just work under that architect, or if you're doing residential decoration, you do not need to go and become registered with the state. This is only for people who opt in to having these rights. So this is a purely voluntary thing. This is a purely opt-in thing. But if you want to have those rights, we believe that interior designers are more than qualified to have those rights and should be able to opt in to work more independently. So we have this bill in Massachusetts. We are working with legislators. We'll talk more about how you can get involved in just a moment, but know that we are trying to bring these rights, and also know that right now you do not have these rights. So when you think about interior design, when you think about public policy and advocacy, and you wonder why ASID and IIDA employ lobbyists, why my job exists, it's for stuff like this. And this, at the end of the day, will really affect how you work, where you work, why you work, and what you can do with your work. It's so important. Next slide, please. So let's briefly talk about design and the diversity of ability. Next slide. So, of course, interior designers, I'm sure students and professors and faculty alike have heard about universal design. I'm sure you're learning about the Americans with Disabilities Act, but interior designers are so important to universal design and accessibility. Interior designers are the ones that are implementing the tenets of the Americans with Disabilities Act and ANSI A117.1, which is the design standard around the act, and you're ensuring compliance in commercial buildings. And in residential buildings, you're doing universal design. You're designing for the blind, the disabled, the infirm, persons with cognitive disorders, and for the aged to ensure safe use and accessibility for all. Next slide, please. So let's break down what the Americans with Disabilities Act is, because it is so important to the work that you do. It's a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with all public and private places that are open to the general public. So this does not apply to residences, but it does apply to any public accommodation, movie theaters, restaurants, schools, everything. It ensures people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. And it gives civil rights protections to individuals with disabilities similar to those provided to individuals on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, age, and religion. And it guarantees equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities in public accommodations. And I was speaking to a journalist just the other day about the ADA. By the way, this is the 30th year of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was passed in 1990. And if you'd like to learn more about interior design's impact, we have some great resources on ASID's webpage. But I was talking with a reporter the other day, and I said that the ADA really is the most important piece of civil rights legislation since the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. This really opened up public accommodations to people who were never able to really use them before, people in wheelchairs, people with cognitive disorders. So it's so important. And ASID was really there at the formation of this law. We had influence on its drafting and its development. A member named William Wilcoff was one of the subject matter experts that advised legislators on what it should say and how it should read. And Shelley Siegel, also a member, also had a lot of influence on it. And she was appointed by President Obama to the U.S. Access Board, which is the government board that administers and makes sure that public accommodations and the standards are in keeping with the tenets of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we are, as interior designers, as the industry, we are very much tied into the work and the policy around this. Next slide, please. So what is the next generation of disability rights and advocacy? As I mentioned earlier, I think it's bringing the ADA into residential spaces. And if anybody on the line is interested in residential design, this is so important for you. A bill that ASID was very influential in helping to draft and provided input on and supported is the Eleanor Smith Inclusive Home Design Act, which would require that any residential space, single-family home receiving federal dollars would have to be built to inclusive design standards. So again, ADA just mandates it on the commercial side. These sorts of bills and acts would require it on the residential side. And we think that's a really intelligent and inclusive thing to do to make sure residences are accessible by all Americans, regardless of ability. Next slide, please. Also, when it comes to the next generation of disability rights legislation, we think neurodiversity is at the forefront of what designers do and where the law should go. Next slide, please. So what is designing for neurodiversity? Well, it's designing for individuals with ADHD, Alzheimer's disease, autism spectrum disorder, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and dyscalculia, Tourette syndrome, Parkinson's disease and dementia, and the comorbidities associated with these diseases like anxiety and depression. Next slide, please. So what are some of the harms associated with neurological disorders, and why should we be training about it, becoming educated about it, and incorporating these tenets into our design work? Well, more than 800,000 deaths per year worldwide are attributed to suicide. It is the second leading cause of death among youth between ages of 15 to 29 years old. In the US, we have the highest rate of teen depression in history. 60% to 80% of workplace accidents are attributed to stress. There are adverse effects of social media, screen addiction, and Facebook depression syndrome, and those are on the rise. So all of our focus on what everybody else is doing when we pull up our Facebook or our Twitter or our Instagram, and the depression associated with that when we're not doing those things. And over 30% of adults will experience a mental health condition in their lifetime. So this is a huge problem. It's a problem that is growing year after year, and it's a problem that interior designers can really mitigate. We are on the front lines of that. Next slide, please. How can interior designers affect these things? And I'm not an interior designer, so I'm sure you all know much more about these issues than I do, but light affects emotion. Natural light, artificial light, and where we place it and how we time it can affect emotion. Colors affect mood. Textures can affect comfort. If you remember when you were a baby or when you were a toddler, those books that we used to read that had the different touch for a sheep and a pig and all those different things, how you feel things and how that makes you feel in return, especially if you're, for example, on the autism spectrum. Space planning and wayfinding, as we talked about earlier, patterns, that affects predictability, and people with cognitive disorders often work better and live better when they have some sort of predictability in their life. And technology challenges. It's great that we have so many touch screens and all that kind of stuff. Certainly helps make our life easier, but for people who are adverse to light or have issues, again, with touch, those technologies can really affect how they operate in a space. So how can interior designers make an impact? Well, very clearly, interior designers can advocate for good legislation and codes and standards development. As I mentioned earlier, codes and standards are the floor, they're the basement for safe and good design. They are the minimal acceptable policies and procedures to create safe spaces. Interior designers need to be pushing that envelope, and we have a policy codes and standards committee at ASID to do that, that we would invite you to learn more about and potentially join in the future. But we need to be advocating for better laws, better regulations, and better building codes and standards that don't just make our spaces safe, but make our spaces inclusive for everybody we've talked about today, especially those with cognitive disorders. Next slide, please. So what are the takeaways of this section of the presentation? First, design can only be as diverse as the background and experiences of its practitioners. You can read a book about design in foreign parts of the world. You can read a book about others' experiences, but really only if you've lived that life and you've experienced that experience can you truly contribute to the broad tapestry, as Denise put it, of design. Design can change lives, and we've talked about the many different ways how design can change lives. And also, design and construction is a highly regulated industry. There are a lot of laws, there are a lot of building codes, there are a lot of rules and standards that dictate how and where and when we build, and how and when where we build and design. And you can shape those laws and regulations through advocacy. So next slide, please. So what is advocacy and why become a citizen practitioner advocate? So we talked about what is wrong in the world, and we talked about what needs to be done in the world. So how can we affect that change? Next slide, please. So advocacy is putting a problem on the agenda. So we put a lot of problems on the agenda today, didn't we? We found a lot of issues within the industry itself. We found a lot of industry within law, issues within law. We found a lot of problems within the way the world works. So we found a lot of problems. We need to provide a solution to that problem, and then we need to build support for action on both the problem and the solution. So again, advocacy is not just pointing out problems. It's also not just sitting in an ivory tower and pointing out solutions. It's gaining public support for those solutions and getting those solutions into law and policy, making them real. Next slide, please. Why should you become a citizen, practitioner, faculty, or student advocate? First, no one knows the subject matter better than you. And I was on a call with some IIDA members just the other day with Emily Kelly, who's my counterpart over there. And some folks were saying, you know, they get really nervous when they go to speak to a legislator. And that's normal. We see legislators on TV. We see them on the internet. We think they're some godlike people. They're celebrities. And that might be intimidating, but I guarantee you there's a single legislator out there who knows more about interior design than anybody on this call. So you are the expert. Nobody knows the subject matter than you. The more people speaking up for interior design across the state and country, the more it will be understood that interior design is valued and important to every community. Again, there's a lot of misunderstanding in the public about what interior designers actually do. It's not decoration, it's not what you see on HGTV. So the more people who are saying, yeah, interior designers are important for my community, that aren't interior designers, your mayors, your builders, your school teachers, whoever it is, the more people we have sticking up and supporting interior design, the better it is for our policy priorities. You can't expect your peers and colleagues to be tenacious and committed if you're not tenacious and committed. Lead by example. If you don't care about what happens with this practice rights bill, nobody's going to care about it. And again, if you don't, who will? If you don't step up, nobody else is going to step up for you. Don't expect the engineers to step up for you. Don't expect the trial lawyers to step up for you. This is your career. This is your future. And that's the last point. This is your future. It matters to your pocketbook, to your wallet. It matters to your salary. It matters to where you live. It is your future. Next slide, please. And nobody is more effective at talking to legislators, and legislators do not care more about anybody more than they do their constituents and the students who are living in their communities, because you, at the end of the day, pull that lever on the ballot box. You are the ones you're their boss. You keep them in office or you kick them out of office. So I can go and I can talk eloquently about the issues that matter to interior designers, but at the end of the day, unless I'm in my district here in Northern Virginia, I'm not voting for that person. So they can say, take a hike, Bryan, but they can't say that to you because you're the ones who are going to keep them in office or kick them out of office. So you are the really effective advocate. Next slide, please. Now, there are a lot of myths when it comes to advocacy. First, that it's only for professional lobbyists. We just talked about that. Constituents are way more effective. There's the myth that advocacy is walking down the street with a bullhorn, or advocacy is rioting in a demonstration or a protest rally. We're seeing a lot of those out there. And while rallies and activism can be useful, they're not always as effective. I doubt you'll see a lot of legislation change because of burning down a building or something like that. We need to measure and balance our tactics when we talk about advocacy. There's the myth that advocacy is the same as fundraising or donating to a charity, right? Money talks, money talks. but it's not the same. Advocacy is all about initiating policy change, which definitely cannot be achieved through just collecting funds. Social change is often achieved with little or almost no funds. Think about the civil rights rallies and whatnot in the 1960s and 70s. It was not some billionaires contributing money to it, it was social change. Advocacy consumes a lot of time. I'm too busy to get involved. Advocacy doesn't have to be complicated and time-consuming. A properly planned and organized campaign requires small actions from many people rather than big ones from a few. And we'll talk about how you can get involved and do small things that can really help us. And finally, that advocacy is all about politics. You need to be a huge fan of Donald Trump, or you need to be a big supporter of Nancy Pelosi. You need to be really conservative or liberal to care about advocacy. That is not true at all. Advocacy can be apolitical. In fact, ASID and IID are nonpartisan organizations. What we do is we support the profession, and that could be a Republican issue supporting the profession or a Democrat issue supporting the profession. Next slide, please. How can you effectively advocate? Next slide. These are two really important metaphors for advocacy. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. You can't show up tomorrow if you've never talked to your legislator and say, Mr. or Miss Legislator, pass this bill for interior designers, or else. If they don't know you, if they don't know how much you care, if they don't know why they should care, you're not going to be able to walk in tomorrow and get a bill passed. To me, it's like asking somebody for money. If you need to ask somebody for money, you're going to go to ask somebody for money, somebody you've known a longtime friend or a family member. You don't go to somebody you met 2 hours ago and ask them for $5,000. You need to build the relationship. You need to plant the foundation. And it's so important. Next slide, please. How do we get legislators to listen to us? Well, it's nearly impossible to change a legislator's mind overnight, as we just talked about. You might move the needle a little bit with an election, and of course, we all know there's an election in November. They tend to listen a lot better when there's election on the horizon, but it's very difficult to do it overnight. It takes time. It requires continuing the conversation over years, not just a one-time activism spike. We need to be consistent in our advocacy, and that's one area where the interior design profession has lagged behind architecture and engineering. Architects and engineers have been at the state capitals for over 100 years. We've really only done it for the last 30 years, and we're getting better every day and every year, but we need to be more consistent in our advocacy. And we also need to show up, and I know this is hard with COVID, but despite emails reach, asking in person, whether it's through Zoom or asking your state legislator to go for coffee or going to their office, it's so much more effective. Next slide, please. And there are a lot of ways to get legislators to listen. We'll talk about some of these. Email campaigns, phone calls from VIPs, so perhaps a dean of the interior architecture school or your president at the BAC would really resonate with a legislator because those people are important to the community. Constituent visits, town hall meetings, letters to the editor, other district engagements, these are all different ways to affect advocacy. It's not just a one-size-fits-all. It's not just, hey, if we send a bunch of emails, we're going to get a bill passed. We need to do all of these things. And if you go on ASID's website, there's a whole handbook as to how to engage with all of these different activities. And I hope you'll take a look. But we'll talk about legislator visits today. Next slide, please. So what is a legislator visit and what do you do? Well, legislator visits are so important. That's the way you go and talk to a legislator about the issue, especially if there's a bill like Senate Bill 165. You start with your greeting, of course. You tell them who you are, and you tell them what interior designers do. And I can't emphasize how important it is to talk about that. I'm a lawyer and a lobbyist, but I represent interior designers. So when I go around to legislators' office, I'll walk in and I'll say, I'm with the American Society of Interior Designers. And the first question I get, how does my couch look in this room? Should I change my wallpaper? And I have to explain, no, that's not what interior design is about. Making a space look aesthetically pleasing is so important. But let me talk to you about the health, safety, welfare implications of interior design. Let me talk to you about the accessibility and inclusivity nature of interior design. Let me talk to you about fire safety. Those are the things that you're going to need to get across. And I guarantee you, especially when you're getting started with advocacy and getting to know a legislator, the greeting and how you introduce yourself is so important. Then you're going to introduce the issues. So let me tell you, did you know that interior designers can own a majority share of an interior design architecture firm? Do you know why that is? Let me explain it to you. Let me explain some of the other issues you're going to hear. You're gonna give your ask. Did you know that Senate Bill 165 would correct that issue? You're gonna tell a story, and we'll talk more about stories in just a minute. You're gonna provide supporting information, and both ASID and IIDA have some great resources online. We call them one-pagers, they're co-branded, so if you're ASID, IIDA, it doesn't matter. That you will leave with that legislator that really dives into the deep policy implications of why they should support or oppose what we want them to support or oppose. And then you're gonna close. Next slide, please. Storytelling is so important. And we know this from our daily lives. If somebody just comes up to you and says, I really enjoy pizza, that's great. You'll probably forget that in a few minutes. But if they tell you a story about when they were a child and this precious family moment and a parent brought home pizza and it was a really hard day for them, but when you tell a story, it really sinks in why it is important, especially for interior design. When you talk about that person in a wheelchair who's now able to use a public library, when you talk about, you design this really great, egress pattern, and it's so important because you have kids in there and the kids need to get out if there's a school shooting, if we're talking about a school and how that path of egress is so important, that really sticks with the legislator as opposed to saying, I'm an interior designer, I create non-structural design elements that are really important to the spaces we inhabit. Telling a story about what you do and why it's important really affects the brain, and you'll see on the screen some of the science behind it. I just think it's common sense. Next slide, please. And after all, I know it's really important. You're getting a lot of information today. I think the slides will probably be provided to you, and we've got a lot of this information on ASID's website. But at the end of the day, make your statements whenever you interact with a legislator clear, concise, and give them a charge. Ask them to do something. Next slide, please. What would be an effective meeting? You completed your ask. You have a commitment. Yes, I will vote for your bill. Or yes, I will follow up with you. I'd like to meet with you in 2 weeks. It doesn't have to be a yes, I'll vote for your bill. Like we said, probably not going to get that on the first date, but agreeing to follow up with you, agreeing to get coffee in 2 weeks, agreeing to read your materials and contact you. That is really important. And follow up agreed to. Mr. Legislator, Miss Legislator, can I talk to you in 2 weeks and see how you digested our materials and see if I can provide any more information? Those are the key elements to a successful meeting. Next slide, please. There's also challenges. You might meet with legislative staff. Legislators are very busy people, especially on the federal level. You might meet with legislative staff, but they're really important too. They're the gatekeepers. They're the ones who will answer the phones. They'll do the scheduling. So if you meet with a legislative staff person, don't worry. They're really important. Make sure that you give them the same respect you would to a legislator. They're almost always unfamiliar with the value of interior design. We talked about that. And you might get awkward questions about HGTV, how their couch looks. Don't get offended. Explain to them, educate them. And again, it is an opportunity to educate and inform people who probably don't know a lot about the value you bring to your projects and to your community. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, how can you get involved? These are just a few ways. There are a lot of different ways, and we can talk about advocacy for hours and hours, and I'm happy to come back and do that. But text ASID to 52886. Many of you are probably on your phone right now. It's very easy to do. Text the word ASID to 52886. Because when we need letters, when we need emails, when we need people to call their legislator on Senate Bill 156 here in Massachusetts, that's how you'll find out about it the quickest and easiest way. So if you got your phone with you right now, do it right now, please. Take the NCIDQ. This is so important. It doesn't seem important to legislation and advocacy, but when we go to create a registry, the best indicator of how successful that registry will be in a state, and the state wants to know people will use and register. The best indicator is how many NCIDQ certificate holders there are. So please go out and take the NCIDQ. Even if right now in Massachusetts it won't help you professionally, it will if we have this registration passed. Register if your state allows it. Become a professional organization member to learn more about advocacy, to have that camaraderie and that organization to affect change. Reach out to your chapter, your school officials about advocacy. Respond to call to actions. Again, if you do that, ASID to 52886. But whenever there's something out there, we always email Denise. We always email your school and usually try to get that sent out to your school address if there's something really important we need you to do to help us from an advocacy perspective. If you join ASID as a professional member, become an ASID government affairs rep. Those are the people who really lead the advocacy in the state. And join a committee. We have something called the Advocate by Design Council at ASID. We have a policy codes and standards committee that informs me and educates me, as they are the subject matter experts, on federal and state government policy we should weigh in on codes and standards. So again, if you think codes and standards are just the basement, join this committee and we can help change the codes and standards to include some of the diversity and inclusion topics we talked about today. We have an ethics and professional responsibility committee, and we have an outreach and engagement committee. So these are all really easy ways for you to get involved. Next slide. And that's it. I have about 7 minutes left for questions. I know that it's not a lot of time, but I wanted to give you all as much information as possible. So Eliza, happy to take questions in the last 7 minutes. And again, if we don't get to them, I'm happy to either come back or try to answer them in another forum. But thank you all for your time and happy to answer questions.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing your presentation and we're going to come back to video.
Great.
And again, thank you so much for that crash course in advocacy and, you know, the power that we have as student leaders at the BISD. Oh, I hear an echo. Strange. But we're getting some questions in the chat, and yes, to everyone, yes, this will be recorded and we can retrieve this later. It'll be on our website. I see a shout out to Denise Rush, who testified on behalf of the profession at the Massachusetts State House. It was scary and intimidating. Denise, you led it with your interior design and architecture colleagues. We're so glad you overcame that fear also.
Okay.
Thank you to ASID for advancing the profession. Question here from Janet in the chat. Bryan, how do I step up? Meaning, you know, what are the first steps? You gave some really good tips, but, you know, what is your best advice for the BIC community for us to take as the first step in this work?
So ASID and IIDA, both on our websites, have a lot of information about the issues on which we engage. Again, ASID, we have a 50-page handbook that is pretty much brand new. It's less than a year old, where we take what we talked about here today and we draw it out to individual details and how to do certain things. Take a look at those resources, but also educate yourself on the issues. And not just practice issues. Of course, those are so important to what you can do and how you can do it and what you can do on a daily basis. But also look at sustainability issues. Look at universal design issues. Look at student debt. We advocate on a lot of things at ASID. We tend to talk about practice rights the most because it's so important to most practitioners. But there are so many different issues that if you're not interested in practice rights, there are a lot of different issues you can get involved in with ASID. But before you get involved, you have to be educated. You have to understand how they affect you, how they affect the practice, how they affect the industry, your community. So before you can get involved, you just have to know these issues and understand these issues. So I'd say go on the ASID website, learn about what issues we engage on, and go from there.
And that leads me to a great question that I know one of our students had asked, but I want to share with everyone, and that is, how do we as students advocate for design in the school curriculum? So in that, what would be your dream curriculum that we're able to educate our interior and our architecture, all our students, in fact?
Sure. Well, I think you're probably doing a lot of it now. Any courses on universal design, any courses that talk about the building code and all these other sorts of things. You affect change by being a credible subject matter expert. Denise is a wonderful example. She can talk about how interior design affects health, safety, welfare, accessibility, universal design. So making sure that students are really educated on the things that really impact regulation and statute, which are health, safety, welfare, right? That is where the regulation begins. It has to affect the health, safety, welfare of the public for it to be a legitimate regulation. So the more we teach about the impact of interior design on these issues, the better interior designers are at tackling fire safety, universal design, all those sorts of things. That's going to be the best way to prepare interior designers to come out, be the credible subject matter experts, And that's when they'll be able to go and testify. That's when they'll be able to affect policy change, because they will be, and they are right now, many of them are, Denise, great example, a credible subject matter expert on a lot of these issues.
Okay. And then I see, you know, can we just go back and touch on one? Someone's highlighted a question, Bryan, that you touched on in terms of designing for all, but particularly designing for all genders, and the concept of how you might think design shapes our bodies and how we interact with the space we're in, particularly now in virtual, even environments.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, design has the power to empower. I think that homeless shelter example and the lighting, just how lighting makes you feel, right? And we're now all kind of staring at ourselves in the Zoom camera. I know I've fixed my hair more than a couple of times as I've been speaking, because you're right there, as opposed to when you're in an office or a school and you don't see yourself as much. So virtual environments are definitely the next wave of where I think interior designers will go. How do we interact with our space in a virtual aspect? But also, advocacy is so important on several issues when it comes to gender. ASID did get involved a few years ago, if you might recall, the North Carolina bathroom bills, which mandated gender-neutral bathrooms. And we did get involved there because, of course, the design of gender-neutral bathrooms will affect interior design, will affect our work. And we have important things to say about how people feel safe or don't feel safe, or feel empowered or don't feel empowered in spaces like restrooms.
Yeah, you know, Bryan, that you may have inspired a new course, interior design for the virtual environment.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be a great thing, and I think it's the next generation of where design is going.
Thank you. Thank you. So I know some of us have scheduled this conversation to go to 1:30, but, you know, I'm seeing we have been able to get through all our questions, and I want to be mindful and respectful of your time. So just, you know, let's put out another call from the audience for questions. And then, you know, we may be able to give some people some time back in the day, which, so we'll say any more questions there. And then I think we've now answered all the chat questions. And my next and final question to you, Bryan, is, as we at the BAC launch our own social justice council, and happens to be today even, what best advice do you have to guide the BAC as we make and strive for new heights there as well?
Sure. I think it's just, again, interior designers have such a unique perspective. And I worked for AIA, I worked for the American Institute of Architects. Architects have a great perspective as well. But interior designers particularly, I think, on these issues, because they are so human focused, because they don't have to worry about the structural issues and the shell and all that kind of stuff, that they have such a unique perspective. So make sure that interior designers are included in the conversation, that their unique perspective is heard, because, again, human-centered design is really how you get inclusivity. It's knowing the emotions, knowing the personal stories and the struggle of the clients you're working for. Understanding that is a great way to bring social justice, because it really evens the playing field. If we have great spaces for all, it really improves the world for everyone.
Great spaces for all. So I think we have one more question in the chat. Christopher says, thanks, this was very good. Christopher works for the state of Massachusetts in accessibility compliance, and he's glad you're working towards more inclusive interior design environments, toward the legislative effort to be more influential, and we can claim him as a BIC alum. So Christopher, thank you for that. We will speak to you later, perhaps. And there it is. So again, thank you, Bryan. We are wrapping up a little bit early, but we've covered our topics. This was our first lunch hour discussion, and we are learning about this virtual space. And 1 hour, we did it in 1 hour. So,
well, thank you, Eliza, and thank you to everybody. Again, my information is on the presentation. I'm sure Eliza will share that with you. If you have any follow-up questions, comments, concerns, please let me know. And again, if you're interested in advocacy, if you're interested in seeing a lot of these problems and solutions we've talked about today instituted into the law in Massachusetts and for the nation, I really suggest you get involved in advocacy, and we've got some great resources on ASID's website to help you do that.
so all right, we're going to sign off and say thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.